Did you know that every 36 seconds somebody dies of heart disease?
Heart disease.
And since 1924, the American Heart Association has been on a mission to help solve the problem.
MC from the American Heart Association is here.
And your tastes will change. I can't imagine even wanting to go back to a diet of junk food.
When all hope seemed lost, there was one who found a solution.
Here are vital statistics.
In 1958, a psychologist by the name of Ancel Keys produced the now infamous 7-country study, proving once and for all that the reason we are having such crazy numbers of heart disease is because of saturated fat and elevated cholesterol, particularly LDL. Huzzah! We had an answer. But here's a problem with that. 50 years after Ancel Keys' amazing discovery, heart disease is on the rampage. Statin drug use used to lower cholesterol is at an all-time high, and so is heart disease. Perhaps we've been looking at it all wrong. So today we are welcoming to the podcast author of 2 books, The Health Evolution and Understanding the Heart, Dr. Stephen Hussey, who's going to talk about his new research that's blowing up in the face of heart disease's standard of care. And hey, if you're enjoying the podcast, make sure to hit the subscribe button and notification bell so that you don't miss any of the amazing guests that we have coming up on the show. And with that, let's just jump right into it. Hey, welcome back to the Road to Recovery podcast. I appreciate you, Dr. Stephen, taking the time to sit down with me and talk about 2 pretty nuanced topics: human evolution, health, what we should be eating, and kind of the dark horse of our society, heart disease, an ever-growing problem, statin use being ever increased. I would say it's being prescribed more and more. And so I'd like to talk about those things. But I know you have your own crazy health history with type 1 diabetes, which I mentioned in the intro to this podcast. But I kind of would like to open the floor up to you and kind of talk about how you became a functional medicine practitioner, what got you interested in this stuff, and your own health journey that led to all of this.
For sure. Yeah, good place to start. So, yeah, I mean, I've had some health issues, over my life. Started when I was really young, 2 years old. My parents just noticed I was coughing and wheezing, and my dad had his own history with asthma, so he recognized pretty quickly that I had asthma. And from there, just kind of one thing after the other. I had terrible allergies. I used to break out in hives all over my body, just these red, bumps all over, and the doctors couldn't tell me why, really. Irritable bowel syndrome. And then eventually all that inflammation ended up as autoimmune type 1 diabetes, diagnosed when I was 9 years old. And so from that point, my family and I were kind of thrown headfirst into Western medicine, because that's what we relied on to help me manage these conditions, but manage being the key word.
Yeah.
And so, it wasn't until probably college that I started figuring out the way I lived my life had a direct impact on how I could, quote unquote, manage these conditions. And so I started, changing lifestyle and getting that feedback from that. And, eventually became interested enough in it that I, went to get a medical education as a chiropractor, and then I got a master's in functional medicine. And it all just made more sense to me, but it still wasn't, it made more sense as far as the treatment goes. But it didn't really give me the answers as to why this happened to me. And so I'm a very curious person. I research stuff all the time. And so eventually I found, evolution, started reading about evolution. And so it kind of gave me the answers I was looking for, as far as, looking at things from an evolutionary perspective and how that explains how, I got sick, or we're suffering from these chronic diseases we do as a society, which are growing and growing. And then because of my history of type 1 diabetes, that predisposes me to heart disease. And so, throughout my entire health journey, I've been, looking into the heart, and every time I hear something about the heart, I my ears perk up and I want to know more about it. And so, eventually I put all that stuff down in a book. And so, yeah, now I have these 2 books, one about evolution, one about the heart.
I do want to know, just while we're here, because I've asked a few other people that I've had on the podcast recently, including Brian Sanders, who you interviewed with not too long ago. I asked him about what you thought about that Harvard, either way, it was a study or a MyPlate suggestion of the various foods people should be consuming. I'm sure you saw the image somewhere around Instagram. What were your thoughts on that? As we'll get into later in the podcast, it'll probably make sense to why you think the certain way you do of that image.
Yeah. Well, everything I've looked at, when I saw that, I immediately think, okay, who funded these guidelines? Because it's very clear that things are included in there because of the funding that Harvard gets from certain people or industry or companies in the food industry. Whatever those companies may be. But that's just, I immediately think that because that's just what I've learned over the years and years and years. But, if you look at that and you didn't know that stuff that I knew, then you may think, oh, it sounds like a healthy, balanced diet. But your body doesn't really care if it's a balanced diet with all these different food groups. It wants the right nutrients. So if you eat a diet that has all the right nutrients, then your body doesn't care where they come from necessarily. It wants those nutrients. And so it doesn't have to be this my plate or this food pyramid with all these balanced food groups. It needs to be a nutrient dense diet. And that's the most important thing. And unfortunately, industry and funding and things like that are influencing the guidelines that we see from academic institutions or government organizations and things like that.
Yeah, I tell people all the time to follow the money whenever it comes to, especially research done in the nutrition kind of world, just because a lot of the studies you need to, even medical studies, you need to go back and find out where the funding is, whether it's coming from a pharmaceutical company, from a university, from plant-based nutritional group, et cetera, any sort of dogma. You want to look it out, because that's the problem I've noticed with trying to do research for whether it's myself or people I work with that are trying to better their health, is that you find all these studies and there's all this nuance because of, whoa, we're getting some seizure over there from the light. I'll put a seizure warning in there for anyone who's watching this in video.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's always some nuance. And so I really implore people to do their own research and really dig deep if they're trying to not take anything at face value, is all I'm trying to say with that. But sure. I kind of want to start too with your first book, The Health Evolution, the key to understanding vibrant health, and why understanding evolution is the key to vibrant health. And as you were doing your research for this book, what were some of the most prolific things that stood out to you in your research that maybe might go against the common grain of what we hear about nutrition? And we'll talk about that later as how it translates to heart health, because I think that'll be, for some people that are not in the know, a revelation to them later on.
Yeah. So when I started reading about evolution, I started putting a lot of things together. When you really, grasp evolution, it puts a lot together for you, because I think most people, think about evolution and they're like, oh yeah, we came from monkeys or something like that. But that's not, necessarily how it works. We in fact did not come from the monkeys or the chimpanzees or the apes, the great apes that we see today. We share a common ancestor with them, and that ancestor looked different than what they look like today and looked different than what we look like today. But when you start to realize that, when you start to study our evolution, what we do know about it, because a lot of it is speculation because we're relying on the fossil record. But it's very clear, especially when we get to like Neanderthals and the first modern humans, maybe like 300,000 years ago or so. It's very clear that meat and saturated fat was a part of their diet. And there's even evidence to suggest that it was what it was almost what drove our evolution to become human today. Without that food source, without our ability to have learned how to crack open the skulls of carcasses and find that fat and eventually become very good hunters, without that stimulus, we wouldn't have become humans. We wouldn't have grown in stature like we have. Our brains would not have grown to the size that they have. And there's some debate on whether or not, the discovery or the control of fire had something to do with that. Because for a long time, we evolved to have these very efficient digestive systems that absorb nutrients very, very readily if they're the right type of nutrients. And then all of a sudden we learned how to cook them too, and they became very, very absorbable. And so there's some debate on whether or not it was the animal foods or the fire, or probably a combination of both. But either way, animal foods played a huge role in our evolution. And so when you think about that, it really makes no sense that a food that we've been eating, that that very well could have made us who we are today as modern humans is now killing us and causing disease like heart disease, which, you know, animal food, saturated fat, red meat, things like that are blamed a lot of times in certain circles for causing heart disease, when from an evolutionary perspective, that does not make sense whatsoever. And unfortunately, it's been a very big distraction from finding what the true causes of heart disease is.
Yeah, I would completely agree, and not to be overly dogmatic, because I mean, on one end of the spectrum, I was somebody who was a really strong believer in the plant-based sort of movement. I never was vegan or vegetarian per se, but I was very Wall's diet-ish, where there's a heavy focus on lots of greens, lots of color, lots of fiber. And if you were to do any Google searches on hunter-gatherer societies, you would see that our ancestors ate 100 to 150 grams of fiber a day, which is obscene amounts of fiber, even in my heydays of eating tons of oatmeal all the time and chia seeds. And I never got past 80, and that was a rough time on the gut, I will have you know. So I think there's also a lot of misinformation out there that when people are trying to research these things for themselves, I mean, if you look up the best sources of iron, for instance, you'll find that the Google's top 10 list is pretty much all plant foods, which doesn't make sense when you're thinking about logically, like you're talking about human evolution. The most bioavailability for our guts to suck these nutrients out of food would have come from animal-based sources, just because it's closest to our physiology. There's not a lot of conversion that has to be done. And it just makes logical sense. So I always try to say people to remove all the cloud around all this stuff and just think about it logically, really basic common sense level, or watch the show Naked and Afraid and see what they try to find. And most of the time it's animal fat and animal protein is pretty much their only focus. And once you see that in a modern setting, that's kind of when it clicked for me personally. But I think a question a lot of people have when it comes to eating like our ancestors is, the idea sounds amazing. There's a lot of different ways we could do that in theory, especially if you subscribe to like the blue zone sort of parameter of eating and stuff like that, which I think has its, you know, flaws as well, just like with everything. But I've been wondering personally, do you eat like your ancestors, like your direct ancestors? So like for me, Northern European heritage, whatever. Or do you eat like your ancestors in the sense of focus around what biologically makes sense? Like I think we could agree would be animal foods to some degree, to a higher extent. And also eat based upon the latitude of where you currently live and the current environment you find yourself in. What is the actual impact that you've seen of eating ancestrally versus what your body is being currently subjected to?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the short answer to all that, because I don't think I have a direct answer to that, but the short answer
it's a very nuanced question.
It's eat whole foods, you know, the most whole foods you can find, and in your area, you know, hopefully locally grown, or foods that, you know, can grow locally around where you are. But eat whole foods is probably the number one thing. If we got, you know, half the people on a standard American diet to eat whole foods, we would see radical shifts in health. We would see radical shifts in the environment. I think we'd see radical shifts in a lot of different issues that we face as society. But I think that, yeah, there's this, you know, there's a lot of talk about eating like our ancestors. And so then you kind of bring up a question of which ancestors. You know, is it the ones that, you know, were first, when the first modern humans were around, or is it the ones, you know, where the first civilizations came around? Like which ancestors should we be eating like? You know, or is it the ones more recent? You know, if my family came from, you know, northern Europe for the most part, should I be eating only foods that grow in Northern Europe? Like, has my body had enough time to adapt to other foods outside of that region? And it's an interesting question that I don't think we know the answer to. And so I default back to eat whole foods, but it's also really interesting to talk about, and a few things to highlight here. One is that evolution takes a very, very long time to happen. So there's these interesting experiments done by this Russian scientist with Arctic, I think it was gray foxes. And he started selectively breeding them for docile traits. And so he was basically trying to domesticate them and see how quickly he could domesticate them. And so, you know, ones that were more likely to come up and eat the food that he offered, or more likely to get closer to him, he kind of sequestered them and only let them breed. And he did that generation after generation. And after about 30 generations, he had pretty much dogs, you know, and they were like pets. And so they have a shorter breeding cycle than humans. But 30 generations is a long time. Like, I don't even know, you know, what, you know, my 4 generations ago, what my ancestors were, who they were, or anything like that. And so, and they have a shorter, you know, reproductive cycle than humans do. So evolution can take a very, very long time. And that's very select breeding as well. Like, that doesn't happen in nature, you know?
No.
It's kind of, it's a bit more random, or I guess kind of through chance, you know, which kind of, you know, selection pressures are put on living things. And so it takes a very, very long time. So if you think about it, you know, I say that because if we think about, say, like, certain groups of people who are or have shown to be more susceptible to, say, the diseases of civilization, like metabolic syndrome, heart disease, diabetes, those types of things. You know, people like African American people, Pima Indians, or Pacific Islanders, people like that seem to get these diseases more often and more severely when they get them, compared to people of, you know, European descent. And so, to me, the answer to that question, the answer to that conundrum, is that, you know, people of European descent had access to, I'd say, you know, more processed carbohydrate type foods much earlier than people of African descent or Native Indians or Pacific Islanders. And so, because in Western Europe, you know, there was agriculture and things like that was more prominent way before, say, the Pacific Islands. Or the Native Americans, right? And so there's been a time for Western Europeans, people of Western European descent, to almost adapt. And by adapt, I mean, like, people who are more susceptible to those diseases to die off and not reproduce as much. You know, that's the reality of evolution. And so that kind of happened before, you know, Western civilization came along and, you know, had all these Western medicine things that kept diabetics and things like that alive, people like that alive. And so then you take, you know, a Pima Indian or a Pacific Islander and you put them into a Western civilization with no real time to adapt to that diet, or the foods that are available, and they get metabolic syndrome way quicker and more severely than people of European descent for the most part. And so it's just an interesting kind of thing. So it's, I guess, to get back to that question is, you know, should you eat, you know, where your ancestors from? I guess it depends on how long your ancestors have been eating that way. You know?
No, that actually makes pretty clear sense. I think it's one of those questions where, like you mentioned, we don't have a clear answer. And I will say that usually conversations don't start out well when they start out with, you know, experiments by Russian scientists. But it is a fascinating conversation to have. And it's one that I've posed to a few other people like Brian Sanders just to get their thoughts on it, because I think about this quite often. And I think maybe we think about it too much, and maybe it's even more simple and we should just be eating generally whole foods. And you kind of have to do this N of 1 with yourself, like you've done probably, et cetera, to really find what level of these animal-based, whatever, how many plants works for you sort of situation. And that's where working with like a coach or someone can be useful. But I think really there's never going to be a black and white as everybody wants it to be. But that's the thing that I dislike heavily about a lot of the other side of this conversation, which is the heavy plant-based community, which is basically saying, like, this is the only way to curb climate change. This is the only way to stop heart disease, despite the fact that it's doing neither of those things. And so that's why I think that it's important to have discussions like this, even if there isn't a clear answer, just to at least get some juices flowing in the brain to kind of get some conversation across, because that's the only way progress ever happens. And I know as a functional medicine practitioner, you focus a lot on metabolic health with your clients. And why is it important to be metabolically healthy?
Yeah, probably the most important thing this day and age within Western society is to be metabolically healthy. So what does that mean? You could define it as, you know, the ability for your body to move back and forth between burning fats and burning carbohydrates predominantly, because your body's always burning some amount of both. But you know, if you eat in a way that encourages your body to run on carbohydrates more and more often, then you almost lose the ability to burn fats readily. Your body still does it, obviously, but you lose the ability to like make ketones and burn fat. And so that's called metabolic inflexibility, because you're relying on one fuel source predominantly for the most part. And so to be metabolically healthy, you want your cells to be able to burn both fuel sources, at the drop of a hat whenever they need to. And so to do that, for most people, you need to, restrict carbohydrates, or at least the processed foods, but especially the vegetable oils. Just, the main processed foods, the big three are like vegetable oils, processed grains, which all grains are processed, and processed sugars. Those are the big three that are pretty much ruining our metabolism. But you could also define metabolically healthy as having a low fasting insulin level, or a good trig to HDL ratio, and things like that. These are things you can measure through blood work. But in general, I define health in a lot of different aspects of health as the ability of your body to adapt to different environments. And so if we're going back to the evolutionary aspect of things, there were times when only animal foods were around, like maybe in the winter. That was the only thing that people could get. And so and they were probably doing a bit of fasting too, because there was probably less animals around as well. So those things encourage your body to burn more fats, make ketones, be in ketosis, that kind of stuff. But then, at certain times of the year in the summer, there's probably berries and tubers and things around that you could find, and those would take you out of ketosis, and you'd be burning more carbohydrate. And so there's this flexibility that the body can have. And so it's the ability to adapt to different situations. It's the same thing with, our metabolic flexibility, the same thing with our stress response flexibility, or in the balance in our autonomic nervous system. It's the same thing with brain neurochemistry, and the ability to move back and forth between different states, and the ability to adapt pretty much. And so if we lose that ability to adapt by creating comfort, then one poor result of that is poor metabolic health, because your body's stuck burning one fuel source, which can have ramifications as far as oxidative stress, as far as buildup of lactic acid, things like that, things we don't want long term. And so, eating in a way that preserves metabolic flexibility is very, very important. And it's one of the ways that we prepare our body, or we train our body to be adaptable to different food sources.
No, 100%. I just wanted to kind of get that one out there for people that may have any questions about what that exactly means, because I think we hear a lot of terms, but we don't necessarily understand the meaning behind those terms, or what specifically metabolic health looks like. And I like to talk about it as sort of this interchangeable, like you mentioned, shift by being able to use both fuel sources. And it shows that you are flexible. And like you said, you could look at various markers like your HDL trigs, you can look at your fasting insulin, which funnily enough, I was on a live yesterday talking to somebody from Heart and Soil, and they were renewing their medical licensure and were having to go through some tests. And I guess in the standard of care, insulin is said to be a very bad marker for metabolic health or something like that, according to the test, which I thought was pretty profound.
Yeah.
As because I've always found that marker to be a little more reliable than even glucose per se.
Yeah, it's the only one that really tells the truth, I feel like.
Yeah, because I mean, like I'm sure you talk about this with clients, but if you have two people with the same fasting glucose, but one person's insulin is like 19 and the other's is 2, that's very different states of being. And this is something that I've been trying to express to my family when they go in for their generic blood work every year or twice a year or whatever. Ask along with your CMP panel, get a fasting insulin to really see what your glucose insulin, relationship is, because that's going to give you a much clearer picture than without it. That's something we'll kind of dive into near the end of the podcast too. Yeah. But I know, like you mentioned earlier, the heart is a really kind of special place for you, and you've dedicated a lot of time to posting about this on your Instagram, which I implore everyone to go check out. And one person every 36 seconds dies of cardiovascular disease. It's probably, I think it's within the top 5 most devastating, reasons of death for Americans in the Western world. And pretty much everyone in their family, or everyone will have someone in their family with it. I don't know anyone that doesn't. And I know that statins are pretty much one of the, if not the most prescribed medications to combat these diseases. And I wanted to know from your experience, what has been the efficacy of statin use for patients in preventing a cardiovascular event? And is it really kind of all it's meant to be? And how many people you think are on statins don't necessarily need to be on statins?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a lot to unpack there. So like,
yeah.
So when all you have is a nail, or all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And so that's what medical doctors have been provided. They've been provided a bunch of hammers, and those hammers are in the form of medications. And so we have the system that's built around identifying symptoms or even risk factors that can be controlled through either a procedure or medication, because that's what Western medicine is armed with. And so there's been this obsession with cholesterol, not only because of some faulty research that happened in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, but also because the only tool that we have is a cholesterol-lowering medication, for the most part. Yeah, it's the main tool that's used anyways. And so there's been this obsession with cholesterol. And, part of my goal is to illuminate for people that heart disease is not all about diet. It's not all about cholesterol. And I would even say, even though it's the biggest chapter in my book, the longest chapter in my book is about diet, just because there's so much controversy about it. I would argue that it's not the most important thing at all when it comes to heart disease and what causes heart disease, which kind of explains why it keeps growing, because we're chasing the wrong thing. Everybody talks about diet. We're arguing over carnivore or vegan, LDL, saturated fat, all this stuff. And we're just totally missing the boat, I think.
I would agree. No, one thing I would add to that is, I'm sure you're going to talk about this in 2 seconds, but for me, I think one of the biggest drivers of disease is this chronic stress that so many people have today, including myself, before I developed any of my health issues. And I mean, if you talk to anyone with an autoimmune disease or some sort of chronic condition similar to that, you'll find like 9 times out of 10, at least I have, that all of this happened after some sort of extreme stressful event in their life, whether that was chronic over a long period of time or a very sudden stressful event. And I think it's partially our inability to deal with these stresses and being in fight or flight constantly, which is just not evolutionarily consistent, that is also driving all this kind of low-grade inflammation. But I'll let you have the floor, because I know you're going to get into all that stuff.
So and stress is a huge one that seems to be ignored, and I don't know why it's ignored, because if you look into the research, it is there. It is very prominent, that stress can not only cause heart attacks, but atherosclerosis, heart failure. Like, it's a huge component of everything. So then you have to talk about what stress is. But first I want to go back to the statins. And so, and they're the most, I think they compete like with one and two with like opioid kind of medications, and then statins over, which is number one, but they're pretty high up there as far as the most prescribed drugs out there. And it's because every time someone comes in, even though they have no symptoms of heart disease, but they take their lipid panel and they have elevated cholesterol, even with no symptoms of heart disease whatsoever, people are put on statin drugs because that's the standard of care. I've been offered statin many times, even when my cholesterol was fine, just because I've been type 1 diabetic for however many years. That was the standard of care. And there's a lot of downsides to these statin drugs. And considering the fact that heart disease continues to rise, even though prescribing tons of these medications, it's obviously not working. So I don't understand why that's still the focus. Well, I do understand. It's because a lot of money is made by pharmaceutical companies who
we're in the wrong business. We're in the wrong business.
Yeah, exactly. At least we're making money anyways. And so, but when you look at the trials on statins, like there's like a few different trials that I talk about in my book, which is like the TexCaps trial and the Scottish something trial. I can't remember.
I know which one you're referencing. I can't remember the full name.
And so if you look at the studies, they say, oh yeah, statins are great for preventing heart disease. But then you look at the statistics in the study, and it comes down to like, I forget which one it was, but it's like 61 people or 62 people would have to take statin drugs for 5 years to prevent one heart attack in one of the trials. And then one of the other trials, it was like 121 people would have to take statins for 5 years to prevent one heart attack. And so that's not very good numbers, not what I would want to, bet the farm on, if I'm trying to prevent a heart attack. And so that's kind of concerning that they're prescribed so heavily, even though that the studies don't show quite the benefit that they claim to be. But the other thing is that it's such a widely accepted theory that high cholesterol, LDL particles cause heart disease, is that you could have a study that was testing something entirely different than for heart disease or LDL or anything like that, some other therapy or intervention, and they just happen to take LDL cholesterol as part of the study parameters or whatever, the study measurements, and they see that it brings LDL down for whatever reason, and the researchers say, oh, but a good benefit or a good side effect that we saw for this is that it could prevent heart disease because it lowers cholesterol. It's like, well, what if it does? What if lowering cholesterol doesn't prevent heart disease, or it's not the number one thing to do? It's so pervasive in the literature and in the minds of, I guess, researchers, that there's so many things that are touted as heart healthy that are not, just because they've figured out that it lowers cholesterol or something. And so we're just really, I think, lost in that aspect of things. And like I said before, it's a huge distraction from what actually does cause heart disease. And I think that just to start off this conversation about stress, is that, and stress is just one of the things, but to start it off, is there's a reason that we say things or that we equate emotion with our heart. Like we say we gave it all our heart when we're trying to do something, or I love you with all my heart, all these types of things. There's a reason we say that. And it's because our heart is intricately connected to our emotional state. As well as our gut. Our gut's pretty connected too. So we have gut feelings about things. We say that kind of stuff. That was not just coincidence that we say that. And so when we look at this relationship between our emotions and our state of stress and balance and our stress response and the autonomic nervous system, and you look into the research, it is just there's so much out there that shows that this is the more important thing to pay attention to when it comes to heart disease.
I think too, people get turned off, unfortunately, from functional medicine when someone goes in to see a functional medicine practitioner. I know this is my experience with my first practitioner I worked with, where I had a lot of discussion about stress and stress reduction and various uses of things like heart math, et cetera, to kind of work on meditation. And at the time, my mind was in this set, like you mentioned, everyone thinks that it's either all diet and nothing, like that's this black and white thing that we've talked about several times. And I was just not receptive to hearing like, oh, maybe I should consider like my work environment and how that stresses me out, or my home life and why that stresses me out, or what are the real traumatic triggers of my stress, and taking into account those things, because those do have, like you mentioned, very physiological effects. I can change my blood pressure immensely just by the way I'm breathing. And I think that's a pretty powerful tool that you can either use or not use. But we kind of had this discussion about LDL. I think I've had a lot of discussions on this podcast, and I'm sure other ones you've been on, with LDL obviously not being the only marker you should look at for heart disease, or cholesterol being the only marker you look at. And that's the problem with the way Western medicine is viewing heart disease, is all these black and white tools and not really finding the nuance. I would like to ask about specific markers you like to look at. I know we mentioned trig, HDL ratios, insulin. I would kind of like to throw out maybe an NMR, particle size sort of thing to look at, looking at your pattern, your LDL particle size, the pattern of your LDL. But is there anything else that you would say are better indicators of overall heart health in the moment, or just overall body health and health in general?
Yeah. So I mentioned the fasting insulin and the trig to HDL ratio, but also the C-reactive protein, high sensitivity C-reactive protein, just getting a general measure of inflammation in the body. I also like looking at GGT, which is a liver enzyme that can give us an indication of oxidative stress in the body. And there's tons of different things you could take as far as oxidative stress, like lipid peroxides and and markers of DNA damage, and just these kind of obscure tests that most doctors probably wouldn't order, but you could go, down a rabbit hole taking those types of things. But inflammation and oxidative stress is what causes the damage that causes atherosclerosis. So it's really important to understand where you're at with those things. And then heart rate variability, I think, is very, very important, which is the best marker or the best measure we know of balance in the autonomic nervous system. So we can talk about that if you want. But then I even, in my book, I even make an argument that the particle size of LDL and different lipoproteins is not as relevant as we think.
I was curious about that because I know there are a lot of people that, quote, go to an animal-based way of eating. I'll just use myself as an example so I don't like spotlight anyone without them wanting me to. But like, for instance, when I went to an animal-based way of eating, my triglycerides went down, my HDL went up, and my my particle size changed where I actually did have more of the small dense LDL, but my other numbers looked great. My insulin was like 2.6 or something, and like everything else was great, and I wasn't feeling completely terrible. So yeah, I would like your kind of nuanced thoughts on that, because like you said,
who's to say that you didn't go on that diet and your body started detoxing as well? And so in the short term, those toxins coming out created some damage to the LDL molecules and made the particle size smaller, because when they become damaged, they get smaller. And so over time, that may have resolved itself. But in my book, I talk a lot about like the lining of the artery and the protection of the lining of the artery, and how doesn't matter how small or dense those LDL particles are. If we have a healthy lining of the artery, there's no way they're going to penetrate the lining of the artery or cause damage whatsoever. But it's the things that cause the damage to the LDL and make it smaller that are the same things causing damage to the lining of the artery. And so we're looking at this LDL molecule that's small and dense and saying, oh, when they're small and dense like that, that's the culprit right there. It's like, well, no, it's the things that created the small dense LDL particles that are the culprit. And so that's the thing, like toxin exposure, poor metabolic health, stress, and all those types of things that cause inflammation and oxidative stress that damage the lining of an artery. And so that's where the focus needs to be, not on, you could do an NMR profile, look at the particle size and the particle number and all those types of things. But those are all indications of how much oxidative stress and damage is there. So there's still good markers on whether or not, like, you risk, but they're not going to tell us the culprit. They're not going to tell us how to fix the risk. It just tells us that it's there.
Right. And I think that's actually the main problem with just most tests in general that most doctors will run, is they just don't give you the why. They give you a marker of, oh, there may be a problem, which is still valuable, like you mentioned, but it doesn't tell you why it's going on. And I hate to say it, but for people that don't think about things like stress, not to say that stress is like everything, because I know anyone with a chronic condition hates being told it's just stress, including me. But when your stress goes up, because then you worry about those markers, things do get worse. I feel I'm always more amped and in pain, quote, or whatever, when I am stressed out about whatever my marker is, etc. So I think,
especially when you get that marker and you're not given a solution on how to correct it, which is very often what happens within Western medicine.
Yes. And especially when you're kind of driven after that to do maybe your own blood work, and you don't have someone to like send it to give you that interpretation, and you're just trying to do it all yourself, which unfortunately a lot of people are doing because of this lack of care in the normal Western style medicine paradigm that we're stuck in for a lot of people. And that's where working with someone like you would be valuable. But I know for like the average person sitting out there, they're probably not necessarily nerding into all this stuff like you and me might be in our free time. But when we go to get our yearly blood work, just for the average person, average Joe watching, that maybe goes in once or twice a year, hopefully at least twice a year, you're getting it looked at. What are some specific things that you would have them ask their doctor to check that wouldn't necessarily be covered in the standard checkup? So like your RBC or your CMP, because for things like thyroid, especially, they only check your TSH. So what would be some things to have in your back pocket to request they look at as well on top of that?
Yeah. So I guess the number one would be the fasting insulin, because they're going to take a lipid panel, they're going to take a CBC, and they're going to take a chem screen. And so there's stuff included in that you could look at. But yeah, the fasting insulin, the high sensitivity C-reactive protein, I think, is important. I think things like GGT is important to give you that measure there. I mean, you could do an A1C, but that's not the most accurate way to kind of assess glucose average. I mean, that's going to tell you about metabolic health right there. And so when I'm thinking about blood work, I want to know, are you metabolically healthy and do you have inflammation or oxidative stress? So that's probably the most basic way, those things to assess that. You could get real into the weeds about blood work and everything, but I don't like to do that as much. I want to that's just one small piece of my assessment of somebody is what that blood work is. And so I don't want people to spend, hundreds or even thousands of dollars on blood work either. That's pretty basic right there. Those things is what I'd want to see from a basic level. And you could think about thyroid, but
I was just using it as an example.
Yeah, I mean, it's important because it's the metabolic hormone. Every cell in your body has a receptor for thyroid hormone, and things don't work right if it's not working properly. And so it's really important, and it is really important to point out that it's not tested very thoroughly. And so, but I would only really do that if someone had some pretty significant thyroid symptoms, and then I'd order that full thyroid test. Not just the TSH. So you want reverse T3 free and total T3 and T4 thyroid antibodies, that kind of stuff. So yeah, and then I'm trying to think of other things. I mean, you could test hormones as well, but I think all that stuff is just kind of downstream effects. Like I would want to test the metabolism first, or the metabolic health first, and correct that. And then if there's still issues, we can look at further testing. But I'd much rather someone spend money on changing their diet than hundreds and hundreds of dollars of blood work.
Yeah, and that's kind of stuff we talked about earlier. So this kind of brings up an interesting point, because I really do agree with you. I think actually you can learn a lot with fairly little information in some degree. If you have, like you mentioned, the HDL trigs and like maybe the insulin HSCRP, and you have those kind of basic things, it kind of gives you a view of like the downstream stuff almost doesn't matter in that moment, because that wouldn't surprise you if that came up because of these problems upstream. So what are other things that, like when you're sitting down in your first meeting with someone in your initial consultation or your intake, what are some of the other things you discuss with them along those lines? Because I know for me, when I would go in originally working with a functional med practitioner, that's all I cared about was that, because that's what all I thought would matter. But like we've talked about before, a lot of other stuff. So what are some other things that you kind of put on priority over those things? Or once you know those things, what do you kind of take into account beyond diet to really address someone's underlying issues?
Yeah, I think, one big one is past traumas or past stressful experiences. And not just that they happened, but their perception of them. And
if they're still living with it.
Right, still living with it. And because it's very evident in the research that if you've had a lot of stressful events in your life, but you don't feel those things contribute to poor health, then they don't. But if you do, then they do. So it's pretty interesting. There's also plenty of evidence that shows that it's the type of stress matters. So if you're having lots of stresses in your life that make you feel out of control, or that you're in unpredictable situations, that's very harmful to your health. Whereas if you have the type of stress that, I picture like an entrepreneur or a CEO of a company where it's a very high demand, you have a lot to do all the time, but you're in control of all that. Then that type of stress does not seem to be damaging to our health as much as, say, the person who's, bottom of the rung at the company, and their job is not secure, their pay is not secure, they don't know, unpredictable working conditions, that kind of stuff. Those types of things seem to be very damaging to our health, which is really concerning for, the last year and a half and how unpredictable everything's been for people, And so yeah, that kind of stuff. I want to know that kind of stuff. I want to know about dental health, because the health of the mouth is very important to the health of the body, especially for the heart and the vascular system. So I want to know that stuff. I want to know. One thing that I'd like to know is what they think is healthy. So I ask them stuff like, what's the 3 healthiest foods you eat? What are your 3 healthiest behaviors? I want to know what they think they're doing that's healthy. And then 3 unhealthiest things. I want to know where I'm at, because they have to meet people where they are.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to just come in saying, this is what you got to do, deal with it. We gotta meet them where they are. And so that gives me an idea of where they're at, as far as what they think, where they're at in their health journey, I guess. Let's see what else. Oh, I always ask about supplements, because unfortunately it's gotten to the point where, especially in functional medicine circles, it's pretty bad in that, lots of functional medicine practitioners take a bunch of blood work and they'll look at that and they'll say, okay, you're low in this, take that supplement. Okay, you're low in that, take this supplement, and then you go home with 15 supplements and you spend all this money and people don't get better. I can't tell you how many people have told me that pretty much exact same story.
I could show you my tray upstairs. It's just full of zinc, full of alpha lipoic acid, and a bunch of other random junk that cost me like $50 a bottle.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, people need those nutrients, but supplements are never going to be. It should never be the center of how you get your nutrients. It should always be food. We just don't know enough about how the supplements, get absorbed or interact or synthetically made, that kind of stuff. But yeah, unfortunately, people have a lot of bad experiences with functional medicine and lose a lot of money because that's the way that it's done in a lot of cases. Not all cases, though. And so yeah, I ask about supplements. Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty much, that's what I want to know to get started. I
think that's good to point out, just because I think a lot of the podcasts that people watch just focus so hardcore on the really intense, sexy details of like LDL and like the saturated fat and the dietary aspect of it. I just want them to know that there's this whole other side of your healing journey that is almost more important than what you're putting in. Like, of course, what you're putting in matters, but it's also what you're putting out into your environment around you, your energy that you put out, your demeanor, the stress that you're under and continue to be under. Those things affect all the other things, as well as how you absorb the stuff that you are putting into your mouth. So that's why I like to talk about it.
It's important too. Like, a good way of thinking about it is that I think most of what we think about it as far as health goes is biochemical, and I think that's in part due to the fact that the pharmaceutical industries are very biochemical and they have the most money. So we know all this stuff biochemically about the body. So whether that's drugs, like pharmaceuticals or supplements or diet, all that stuff is more or less biochemical. And we think about, interactions in the cell and these different pathways and things like that. But there's also a physics side to our body. I call it the physics side. I don't know if that's the correct term for the best term.
Sounds good. It sounds good.
Yeah. Physics side. And that's, the environment your body's in, the sunlight, the sound, the sleep you get, like all this other stuff. Like, what type of environment is that? What's your body facing there? The stress, all kinds of stuff that make up that aspect of health. And so it's really taking the emphasis off biochemical and still, thinking about that, but also getting an assessment of where's this physics of this person's body at? Like, where are they dealing with?
100%. Love that. Bo, though, talking about the heart, I've heard you talk about this on other podcasts, and you discussed it in your book. People, I mean, in generic nutrition, if you were to talk to a registered dietitian, which I've talked to many, etc., carbs are like the #1 source for your body, the preferred fuel, all this, good stuff, like carb up, like you need it. But you kind of have a different perspective on the heart's preferred fuel, not necessarily being carbohydrates. And maybe you can explain why that is and what research you've read that supports that, because I find it really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it seems that most organs, but the heart specifically, prefer fatty acids and ketones for fuel. And there's a few studies I talk about in the book, and I've posted on Instagram and stuff that illustrate this. One, there was even in the presence of glucose floating around, when they put ketones into the the substrate or whatever, the heart cells utilize that more than the glucose, and the glucose utilization dropped 30 to 60% based on the cells they were using. So it's very clear that even in the presence, there's plenty of glucose around. That's the easier fuel to burn, and the heart cells shifted and chose the ketones and fatty acids. And to me, I think there's reasons for that have to do with what I call metabolic heart attacks. That's a whole other discussion. But but yeah, so there's plenty of evidence that that's the case. And again, not just for the heart, but for most organs. And so it's interesting, because when you think about, getting into ketosis, you have to restrict those carbohydrates in order to get your body to learn how to burn fats again. We have to do something like that. Whereas the heart seems to have this pre-programmed thing in it that regardless of how
it just takes it in.
Yeah, more metabolically healthy we are or unhealthy we are, it wants the fats first. And I think that has to do with the fact that, the cells in the heart can't necessarily reproduce or create new cells. And so we have to preserve those cells. And that's one of the ways that it does that. But yeah, so that's pretty interesting. And it led me down this path to the metabolism of heart cells. And I think that we don't necessarily have to be in ketosis, to create enough ketones for the heart. Like, it has mechanisms in place that make sure that it gets enough fatty acids and ketones, or gets those first. I'd say one of those is that fats in our digestive system are kind of absorbed and put into chylomicrons, which are these big molecules that carry around the fats, and those actually go into the lymphatic system, and they're transported up to the to more or less the heart first. They go into the veins that go into the heart. They drain into that, but then they go to the lungs first and come back to the heart. And the heart is the first thing supplied when they come back from the lungs and out of the heart again. And so it's almost like the heart's getting the first dibs, so to speak, on these fatty acids. And then also very recently, I found a study that showed that the heart cells have a direct communication pathway to fat cells. And so, if they're struggling for fatty acids, there's this communication pathway that picks up on that, and we mobilize fat from the fat cells. And so that there's more fats available for the heart to utilize. So it seems that it's pretty important that the heart has enough fats to utilize all the time, and it never has to shift more to burning glucose for more than a little while, because, like I said, it's always burning both at the same time. But predominantly, it seems to prefer to predominantly burn fatty acids and ketones.
Is that partially why we see when someone becomes really fat adapted, that even when they try to kind of reintroduce carbs, they kind of have this glucose sparing effect where their body is still rather producing ketones and kind of not using the glucose to push it into muscle because the muscles have become fat adapted?
Yeah,
am I thinking too much?
That doesn't necessarily, I think, have to do with the heart. That just has to do with the sparing,
the metabolic state, the sparing
effect. Yeah. I mean, so like, yeah, if we do go into ketosis and we stay there for a very long time, then your muscle cells are going to, they're not going to use glucose as much. They're going to become insulin resistant, so they don't take the glucose into the cells, because there's other cells in the body, like the red blood cells and things like that use glucose, and that's what they use predominantly. So they're preserving it for that. And so then if you give someone a glucose challenge and those muscle cells are insulin resistant, it looks like they're insulin resistant, right?
So how do you combat that? Because I know that's a thing that happens for a lot of people. They go, I mean, this including myself, but like other people that have done ketosis for like a long period of time. Is it necessarily bad that you're there, or is it?
I think the way we combat that is to understand that metabolically healthy does not mean ketosis all the time. It means that you're flexible enough that you can have a meal or two or three in a row or something with no carbohydrates in your body. That's just fine. Or you can have a meal with carbohydrates and blood sugar stays stable and everything's fine. Or you can eat twice a day, and one of those meals could have a decent amount of carbs in it, but you wake up from your fast the next morning and you have ketones present. That is, to me, that is metabolic flexibility. There's ketones around. That's plenty. That's enough. Your body, your heart's always going to prefer those. And like I said, there's mechanisms to make sure that it gets those. Whereas other cells in the body may, be more flexible and they can burn both all the time, or predominantly go back and forth to burning predominantly one or the other. Whereas the heart prefers to predominantly burn fats all the time. And so if you're creating that situation, then I think we're fine. And so we don't have to be in ketosis all the time. Now, when I work with clients who are extremely metabolically unhealthy, I put them on a ketogenic diet, because in 2 or 3 months, it's going to be the quickest thing to get them to metabolic health. After that, after they achieve metabolic health, then it's like, hey, whole foods. So whole food carbohydrates are fine. You don't want to eat only whole food carbohydrates, but you can have berries, you can have sweet potato if you want, that kind of stuff, some of the winter squashes, things like that. It's not about a dogmatic approach to a diet. It's about achieving metabolic health. And research clearly shows that all kinds of diets can do that. We just have to, be smart about it and not get caught up in dogma.
Nope. Love it. Love it. So the last thing I kind of want to talk to you about is genes. I know a lot of people, including my father, who's going to watch this. And yes, I did call you out. Like to think that genes are the arbiter of all of our problems. And because we have the genes for heart disease that, Ryan, you might just be destined for high blood pressure and you're just going to need meds because it's in your genes. And I do. I have like FTO genes. I have some diabetes genes. Everybody's got these genes. How important are genes to applying this sort of way of eating? Or just lifestyle in general? How important are genes to the whole picture?
Yeah. And this is the conversation or the topic of epigenetics, and which literally means above genetics. And, our genes are our genes. It's the hand that we're dealt. And there's nothing we can do about that. However, we can change the way our genes express themselves to an extent. And that comes from environment. So, the famous functional medicine, I heard it first from Mark Hyman, was, your genes load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger.
Pulls the trigger, yeah.
Right. So we have to pay attention to that. And this has been proven over and over again in the literature. But I think it's very, very interesting, though. And, sometimes these are uncomfortable conversations to have. But it's very interesting that when you think about things from an evolutionary perspective, you're bringing it full circle again. Evolution selects for the strongest genes or whatever, the fastest, the quickest or whatever, the genes that are best fit for an environment. And if you look at the modern environment that we've created for ourselves, we've made it so that it's easiest to survive, right? Even if we have a poor set of genes that are not well fit for our environment. And so that explains the difference between why some people can eat a standard American diet and, get heart disease in their 20s or diabetes in their 20s or even younger, and then other people can smoke and drink and eat a poor diet their whole life and they live to be 80.
Yep.
And it's because they have, I call it like a hardier set of genes. Their genes are more resistant to the less than optimal, I'd say, lifestyle that is Western civilization. And so if evolution had been allowed to take a course and we were living in the harshness of nature, I would say, then those people that had less than optimal genes wouldn't have made it.
Yes.
And those genes would not have been passed on. But that's not the reality of today. And I'm not saying that that's what should happen. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying that it helps us understand why some people find it really hard to achieve health in our modern day world. And some people, it seems easy for them. And so some people have to work harder than others based on their set of genes to create the right environment that creates good gene expression. And then we also have to take into account the fact that we may have become enlightened to the fact that the way we live our lives has a direct impact on how healthy we are, like in our 30s. Then we had this 30 years before where we weren't paying attention, where we accumulated all these things where our development, our autonomic nervous system developed, our metabolism developed in this time. And it's hard to get rid of those set in stone, not set in stone, but those ingrained, imbalances. That's what I should say. And so it's hard. Like if you don't start doing this till your 30s, it's like, man, I got a lot of work to do, and it's gonna be a long process, But even then, it's all this difference in genes. But we should not be a slave to our genes. We should not just accept, oh, I have these genes, I'm screwed.
Yep.
Because there's always something you can do, no matter how hardy or less hardy your genes are to the modern environment. There's always something you can do. And so for me, that's hopeful for everybody.
I would 100% agree. I would like to kind of end this on the fact that while it's human nature to kind of take the path of least resistance, just evolutionarily. I mean, we would always like, if there's going to be abundance of food, got to jam that down because who knows when we're going to eat again, kind of thing, from an evolutionary basis. I think that if you're somebody that no matter how hard the challenge may be, but is willing to put in the actual work to do it, you can achieve a lot of things. I've seen it like time and time again. But that's also why I implore people to work with other people that are professionals and can kind of hold their hand and guide them as they're doing this. But you do have to be the one to put in the effort for yourself. So I really appreciate this conversation, you taking the time to talk to me and just kind of really just touch the nose of all of this stuff, because we could have gotten really granular and into the weeds. But please let people know where they can follow you. I'm going to have all these linked down in the description, your Instagram, your website, all that stuff. So please, the books, where can they find them? And we can end on that note. Cool.
Yeah. So people can find me on social media. I've kind of been less involved with it lately, but I'm still on there every now and then. On Instagram, I'm Dr. Stephen Hussey, Dr. Stephen Hussey, and Facebook and Twitter as well. My website is resourcerhealth.com, and my book is, or my blog is there. My books are on there. That's people can contact me for health coaching. If they're interested in working with me, they can do that through there. My books are The Health Evolution is on Amazon right now. The Understanding the Heart is, I had to take that down because I signed with the publisher. And so we're working to get that republished through them, hopefully, by early next year, but we'll see. So, just follow me and stay tuned to the website for updates on that one. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Dr. Stephen Hussey, it has been a pleasure. I am honored.